let's bring in Delegate Markheim, if we could. Fantastic.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Seth, and thank you, Declan.
Yeah, let me give you a little intro. You've got a great story. I'm going to call you Mark for
of course,
today. Mark's been a member of the House of Delegates since 2009, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And he represents a good portion of Fairfax County, Tysons, where we're located here, and various other parts of what is otherwise a very large area of Fairfax County. You are the first Asian-born immigrant and Korean-American ever elected to statewide office in Virginia, correct?
I guess so. I am.
Yeah. Check your website if not.
Yeah, sure.
I know it's true because I read it on Wikipedia. No, just kidding. And the great thing, Mark, about having you here is not only are you on sort of the forefront of legislation that's going on and legislation nowadays that's impacting everybody, businesses, employees, everything in Virginia, but you're also, a lawyer, one of the few of us in town, as well as a businessman and entrepreneur. So, you've sweated out those aspects of how to make a payroll. And not all legislators have done that. And until you've had to sweat out in difficult times, and these last 3 months have been difficult times, you really don't know. So what is it, first off, welcome again, Mark, and what is it that you're hearing from your business and executive constituents here in the Tysons Corner, Northern Virginia, Fairfax area?
Well, first of all, Declan, thank you, and Seth and Todd, and of course our friends over at Virginia Lawyers Weekly for inviting us and hosting this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you. Anytime I can leave my basement and come out and spend some time with folks, it's a great opportunity. As far as the current situation, I think all of us, whether we're in Tysons or any other part of the Commonwealth or anywhere in the country for that matter, we're all frustrated, no question about that. This is not the life that we all wanted to live at this stage, and we certainly didn't expect not only the health pandemic, which is horrible, and the economic recession, but now we're looking at racial tensions around the country, the issues of systemic racism and police brutality. So all these things happening at the same time makes it extremely difficult for the average American to weather the storm, if you will. But on the other hand, I think we are at an opportunity, especially at the state level, but we're at a point of opportunity where we have to decide what kind of a state we want to be, what kind of a future we want to have. And the most exciting thing for me is you and I, as regular folks, as well as some of us who have the opportunity to write policy, we can decide for ourselves what the future will be. We no longer have to be just constantly being reactive to what's going on. I think you're right, Seth, that the next, whether it's the second wave or third wave, we're now ready for it. This isn't something that's hitting us out of left field. We now know what to anticipate. We know we have some processes by which we can deal with the public health crises, and we have some tools at our disposal on the economic. So the question now is, what do we do? What kind of steps we take, and what does everybody, each piece of that pie, how do we ensure that everybody does their job?
Yeah, Seth was talking earlier about the McDonald's case, and Amazon both have gotten hit with lawsuits for employee and who have contracted COVID or maybe have infected their loved ones with COVID. Seth, we've been debating this with our clients as to this issue of immunity, and our clients have said, from a legal standpoint, can you create a written waiver of liability?
Big issue, and it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on that,
and whether there's any legislation.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, so let me explain a little bit about where we are statewide in terms of our legislative process. Most people know that Virginia, like most states, have a part-time legislature. Mm-hmm. So our General Assembly session ended already in March. We went from January through March. But of course, as soon as, literally on the day that we were leaving Richmond on March 11th to 12th, the governor ordered his emergency declaration. And since then, we've been in this pandemic-related emergency. We did go back to session once in April when we met outdoors and to deal with some of the governor's vetoes and amendments. We're anticipating sometime in the next 2 months or so, I believe it'll be about middle of August. In fact, I'm going to see the governor this afternoon. He's in Northern Virginia to do a briefing on phase 3, when we can anticipate going to phase 3. But part of that conversation is, how do we, the legislature, come back into session in Richmond in the middle of August to be able to deal with and readjust our situation? And at that time, I think we'll be looking at a lot of different legislation and policy ideas, including what do we do for the businesses? What do we do for our families who are struggling? What do we do for our schools as they're reopening? And most importantly, from a health perspective, are there ways that we can ensure that our hospitals, our healthcare professionals, nurses, and doctors have all the tools they need? So a lot of the issues that we can talk about today hopefully will be addressed in August. And one thing I'll plug while we're talking about this, if you are an attorney or if you're a member of our business community who have interests and ideas or specific problems that you're encountering, please let us know, because all of us are interested in hearing from the ground what's going on in Virginia and how do we as your part-time state legislatures address this so that we can ensure that not wait until next year, but immediately in the next couple, 3 months, we can start putting some policies in place.
Yeah.
So as an employment lawyer, as we were going through the COVID crisis the last couple of months, and all of a sudden it just hit us that you all were quite busy down there this past session, even though it's only a 4-month session. You were quite busy, and really companies, as they turn the lights on in the workplace, are really coming into a very different work environment from an employment law standpoint in Virginia. As an employment lawyer, most the employment laws in Virginia have it mostly defaulted to the federal sector. But that's no longer the case. So let's talk about how that came about. You got the Virginia Values Act. You've got Virginia Wage Payment Act, misclassification of independent contractors, a whole lot of these things. Let's talk about that. What was the thinking behind that? Mm-hmm. And knowing that Virginia is such a magnet for businesses, what was the considerations that went into that to make sure that Virginia continues to be sort of the leader, the go-to state for business across the country?
Sure. In fact, it's interesting when we sit here in June and think about March, it seems like it was BC versus AD, right? BC as in before COVID.
Yes.
And what we did in January through March this session in Richmond was really an unprecedented amount of work in terms of making progress on various issues from economics and business and wage and labor issues all the way to healthcare, social issues, of course, and gun control, and many other issues, environmental areas, which is something I've focused on, clean energy and renewable energy issues. On the labor side of it, I think we have to start by understanding where we were. Virginia has always been traditionally seen as a kind of a pro-business state. We've had right to work in our laws for a long time. We've had a long policy of referring, as you said, Declan, to the federal law in terms of minimum wage and other protections. And so Virginia has not been a proactive state in terms of labor rights or workers' rights. Because of the election that happened last year where Democrats have now taken over both the House and Senate with a Democratic governor, that gave us obviously a different political and philosophical outlook on shifting, not necessarily going from one direction to another direction, but adding some balance to this so that it's not just about focusing on the employers, but looking at the employee side as well. And so adding a little bit of workers' rights to the mix. And so we did pass a minimum wage increase. We also did pass some collective bargaining and a few other, wage, as you said, wage theft and other classification issues. Those did pass.
One of the things that really strikes me about this is that we're talking about a sea change, things that are going to be fundamentally changing and just turning the light on immediately on July 1st, right?
Yes.
With regard to brand new claims of regarding discrimination, misclassification. There's just a whole new wave of cases, for example, also with respect to cases and issues regarding pregnancy discrimination, no gateway of even having to go to the EEOC or a local employment protection agency, but going right to court. Do you think that businesses are aware of this sea change that's coming? Because we're literally days away from this, and as you both are saying, people are going to be coming back. And do you think that people are aware of these huge changes? What can be done in Richmond to kind of help project how much of a sea change this is? Because this is a really big deal, and it's literally happening within the next couple of days.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the frustrations of being a part-time legislature and being in Virginia at the state level is that most press, as well as members of the public, don't pay attention to what we do. I always refer to this as something that's unique to us in Northern Virginia. Our hometown newspaper is the Washington Post. And so most states in the country, their local papers cover the local issues. Here, our local issues is what happens at the White House.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of that mismatch between our interests as residents and workers in Virginia versus the conversations that happen at the national level.
Somebody in Washington might have a little bit of a louder voice once in a while.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I'll put it this way. I don't think that as much as we've had some sea change, policy changes, both in employment as well as other issues, I don't think it's necessarily one that businesses should be concerned about. And I'll say this as a Democrat, I don't believe that any bill that we pass this year, no matter how my friends on the other side might call it progressive, for labor rights and such. If a business is doing the right things, if a business is reasonable, if a business is accommodating to its employees' needs, there's no reason why the businesses have to fear the retributions, if you will, of what they've been doing wrong. In other words, for example, Values Act, which is the Virginia Values Act, it's the first time as a southern state we passed a law that would protect LGBTQ rights at the workplace. Something that the Supreme Court just told us last week that is now the law of the land. And so even though Virginia might have been one of the first conservative states to go in that direction, the reality is that the rest of the nation has followed. So if a company out there, whether you're in Virginia or elsewhere, if you were or planning on discriminating your employee based on LGBTQ rights, that shouldn't have been happening anyway. And so I don't think that's a sea change from our perspective.
Yeah, and I think for that particular issue, I think a lot of the local human rights ordinances and the local human rights organizations, Fairfax County, Alexandria, Arlington, they had already picked up on that classification. Most of our clients have already incorporated those into their handbooks. So I agree with you. I don't think that size of it. I think the biggest change from the Virginia Values Act is this notion that everything can go into state court very quickly, because in Virginia, the name of the game has usually been get diversity jurisdiction and go into the rocket docket, the federal system. Yeah. So I think it will open up a lot of litigation in state courts. It probably, from a legislative standpoint, will have you all maybe potentially revisit this notion of whether or not defendants can use summary judgment deposition transcripts. I know it's a little in the weeds, but in other words, making sure that cases don't get tied up for a long period of time. In that. But keep in mind, in Virginia, there's already been the federal system, all the federal laws that have been triggered anyways whenever there's a workplace dispute. So I agree with you there. It's interesting. I will tell you, I have heard from a lot of employment lawyers. One lawyer in particular said, is Virginia the new California? Because we all know California has, probably the pendulum went way on the other side in terms of regulations and stuff. What do you think when you hear something like that?
So I think what's interesting is if you step back for a little bit away from the conversation about labor law just for a second and think about the long history of Virginia and our relationship from the state law to the federal law, it wasn't that long ago. It was only 50, 60 years ago that the federal government was what came in and fixed the state from where it was. Obviously, we had the Civil Rights Acts, the massive resistance. We had Loving versus Virginia. So in Virginia, like the rest of the southern states, the laws at the state levels, based on the 10th Amendment, based on states' rights, were so conservative, so anti, if you will, minority diversity rights, that the federal government had to come in. And because of that tradition, for 50 years, we relied on the federal government for everything. Now that the pendulum has swung on both ends, the state itself is becoming progressive and the federal government is becoming more conservative, we're now seeing that for the purpose of expanding rights, we ought to give the states more rights rather than relying on the federal level. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this interesting dichotomy of relationships and philosophically aligning in different ways.
Think about how the world has changed nationally, but also in our region, literally within the last 5 to 10 days. You see what the Supreme Court did from the employment law decision in terms of the Bostock case, which is what we're talking about. The new laws coming into effect on July 1st. The social protests that are going on in this region and throughout the country. So these are changes that are literally happening today as we're sitting here today.
And this morning you had the DACA decision, the
literally
Federal Dreamers Act. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And meanwhile, business has to go on and people have to remain employed.
And adjust, too.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think that both of you gentlemen are bringing up, which also I think is interesting, is that when you talk about changes and when you talk about changes in our laws, there are aspects of process and there are aspects of substance. In terms of the process, now a lot of these cases that never even existed before are now going to be flowing through the state courts and the state venues in Virginia. People, as you had correctly noted, people would just jump into the federal judiciary. This is going to be a game changer. It's going to be a whole new venue and a whole new ballgame in July.
So bringing this back to a little bit of what's going on with COVID and the coronavirus situation and the public pandemic, one of the interesting areas that we had not anticipated back in March that we had to quickly pivot and deal with was the fact that, as you mentioned, PPP, when the federal government passed its CARES Act, one of the many provisions within the various different versions of the relief bills was in expanding our unemployment compensation.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
And so, Virginia, like most states, had a very narrow level of the types of categories where you can have unemployment claims.
We call it underwhelming. It was always underwhelming.
And all of a sudden, we had to add to that the Uber drivers, the Lyft drivers, the independent contractors.
Independent contractors for the first time.
It took at least a couple of weeks for our system, a very old, system, antiquated computer system, to add all these new codes in there to be able to process these checks. And so that's a change that the federal government has created in light of a pandemic that we have to adjust. Now that having done that, we're not going to go back and say, okay, after this pandemic is over, if you're an independent contractor, you're out of luck from Virginia, right?
So that's great to hear. So in other words, you're saying that as a result of some of these changes, that maybe at the end of the day, they're not going to be temporary fixes, right? In other words, the unemployment compensation program in Virginia, and frankly across the country, has been pretty anemic. It really is just a bare bones thing. The federal government came in and was kicking in $600 under what we call sort of the supercharge.
And also this distinction between W-2 employees and 1099 contractors.
Yes.
We have this change now through this state turbocharged process where now independent contractors are also being treated differently. So it sounds like we may be breaking some news with you today. In other words,
so I'll put it this way. I come from the tech industry, and I've spent 20-odd years in the beginning of the wireless industry from the time that we went from the analog cell phones to what it is now. And, obviously, internet and broadband and wireless is ubiquitous. And as part of that transition over the last 2 decades, what we saw was disruption after disruption. So just about every sector of our economy has been disrupted. You don't see a single sector that went from analog to digital going back and saying, I like the old ways. Bring back my wires. You don't see that. And so most sectors that transition end up expanding rights. And if you look through history for the last 250 years of our American experiments, every time there was a huge crisis, whether it's man-made or natural, that's when, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, that's when the disruptions are forced upon our society. And so we open up expansion of rights. We open up different business models. After the war, I mean, classic example is World War II, and how much the military-industrial complex has revitalized and reformed everything, including our education system, the fact that women are now much more in the workforce because of the fact that we had more men overseas, and so women fill that labor gap and such. And so we see major transformation in our society based on crises, and this is not going to be any different.
Yes.
Well, but let me ask you this. It's so great having you here because you're right out on Front Street on the front line dealing with this. When we were coming to terms with where we are in the January and February timeframe, and again, I think this is just an observation that isn't intended as a political jab at one side of the aisle or the other. We were caught flat-footed. As we sit here today, over 115,000 Americans have died. Over 40 million Americans are unemployed. Hospitals were at the breaking point, short on PPE. What are we doing here differently today in light of this staggering crisis to make sure that we're ready tomorrow?
Yeah, that's probably the most important question that all of us can be asking. As we sit here today, we have 55,000 Virginians who have now tested positive. I'm sure there are a lot more than that. At least 1,500 of our fellow Virginians has lost their lives as a direct result of COVID. And unfortunately, I'm sure those numbers are going to go up. Yeah. And so the reality is this crisis, like many other health crises, is a deadly crisis that if we don't deal with it, it will impact us. The good news, to the extent that there is good news, is that now we know the science. Now we have the smartest people in our country and indeed the world looking for vaccines and for therapeutics. So I think this particular crisis we will deal with in the next 6 to 8 to 12, 15 months. But what's around the corner? What's the next virus that we're not aware of? What's the next time that we see a pandemic that comes around where we're not ready? So I think if there's a wake-up call here, it's that we have to put our money and our time and resources into R&D. And I'll just point this one out. About 6, 8 years ago when both, and this is a bipartisan conversation, both Governor McDonnell and Governor McAuliffe and now Governor Northam have all focused on one message, which is we cannot be a state that's dependent on one industry, which is the federal government. Right. We have been for too long dependent on the federal government. We have to diversify our economy. And what that means for us in Northern Virginia is technology, biosciences, life sciences. Obviously, military is going to be part of that, but not the brick and mortar military, not the aircraft carriers and tanks, but cyber and looking at intelligence. And so we were starting to focus on diversifying our industries anyway. This is now forcing us to really put more research and money and effort into healthcare and life sciences, which is something that I welcome as somebody who supports our biotech industry.
So it's still a major focus for Virginia to remain business competitive, stay up at the top of that list for business competitive, bringing new companies in. It sounds like that's the case, and it sounds like nothing that was done even in the last session really was intended to change that in any way. If anything, maybe to strengthen the relationship between the employer and the employee.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this. I think the only, I mean, obviously my friends on the other side of the aisle would come up with different partisan talking points, but this isn't a talking point. This is literally just the way I happen to look at it. This is the way a lot of my friends look at it. We can have a state that is pro-business and pro-worker at the same time. I think we were given this false choice that you got to be either for the company, the business side, the management side, or you have to be for the worker, the employment, the labor side. There's no reason on earth why you can't have both. And for people like me and others who've been on both sides of that equation, both on the management side and on the employee side, the best companies are the ones that employees want to work for because they're loyal to them. They get good benefits. And then the flip side is the best employees are the ones that show up asking the management to do more so that they can have a whole fulfilling work experience.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning in your intro, it's heartening when I see politicians, legislatures, where they're made up of people with broad-based backgrounds that, again, have been in companies before, have seen what it takes to make a payroll. So we only have you for a few more minutes. We know you're going over to Governor Northam's briefing in Fairfax County today. I guess the one thing I would say is you've got the next budget session coming up in August.
That's right.
Give us sort of a preview of some of the things that are being talked about from a priority standpoint in the budget. I have to imagine that COVID has changed a lot of the budget priorities. Give us a flavor for where that's going to go.
I'll give you three quick buckets, and obviously we can have more conversations. And I look forward to staying in touch with everybody. And please contact me anytime.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Google my name, and you'll find my contact information. But there are three buckets. One is, of course, anything that's directly related to COVID. And on that front, here's what happened. If you saw the numbers from the last 2 months, the April revenue forecast that we saw, the actual numbers coming in, were down by about 26% from where we should be year to year. May numbers, which just came out last week, were down by about 20%. Now, those two are anomalous because we moved our tax deadline from May 1 to June 1, and so we had less money coming in. We're looking forward to seeing what the June numbers are, so middle of July we'll know those numbers. Based on that number, we will go into special session in August and readjust the budget that we passed. I mean, we passed a very robust budget that did a lot of different programs. Obviously, we're going to have to scale back on that. So that's one bucket, which is just COVID-related revenues, the lack of revenues, and spending towards the unemployment, workers' rights, and what have you. Second bucket, I think, are things that are long-term. How do we adjust our lives so that we're actually investing into things that will prevent us from going into a further recession, for example, on education? How do we ensure that when kids can't go back to brick-and-mortar schools, that our online education system is as robust as it can be?
And child care, too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I mean, we had about $70 million from the federal government on the child care subsidy, the block grant. That's going to run out at some point. Do we put some more money into that? So things that are long-term going forward as we reopen and recover from this crisis, how do we ensure that our state is putting our money into those right places? So first bucket is just filling the gaps. The second bucket is investing in the right places going forward. And then the third bucket is something that, frankly, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we wouldn't have been talking about. But in light of what we're seeing with the police brutality, the need for reform, the need to address systemic and institutionalized racism, the idea is how do we ensure that our police and the so-called defund the police movement, how do we ensure that some of those monies are used for mental health, for racial concerns, as opposed to just going back to the old law and order mentality. So that bucket of money and policies will be a new area that we hadn't anticipated, but they all do relate because at the end of the day, what we want is a healthy, safe, and a strong economy for everybody. And for those that are at the lower end of the spectrum, we want them to be able to survive in Virginia.
Well, I think that you, by being here today and sharing in this conversation, I think you've helped us understand not only what's happening right now, but what's coming right around the corner for businesses, for employees, employers, and for people within the region. So this has been tremendously helpful and really has helped move the conversation forward.
No, absolutely. When we put this together, we said, listen, we want people who are in a position that are actually, making the laws, making the decisions on the front lines. And that's why we asked you to come in here today. Mark, and we really appreciate it. Appreciate your time, and you know what? Appreciate maybe continuing this conversation. Hope we get to bring you back in, and maybe after the August session, we do kind of a follow-up to this, and hopefully we're not talking at that time about a second wave.
Well, thank you very much, Declan and Seth and Todd. And, of course, thanks to Paul and everybody over at the Virginia Lawyers Weekly for putting this webinar together. I look forward to staying in touch and being of help and answering any questions that you might have.